the Lane. This is the podcast channel from Carriage Lane for Christians and those seeking to explore grace, liberty, and truth through the lenses of faith, culture, and philosophy. For today's episode, we're going to discuss the book Remaking the World by Andrew Wilson. So Rick, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad to be here talking with you about this interesting book.
Thanks. I'm a little bit daunted to talk about it. I've read it once. I'd like to read it a second and third time. It's dense enough. And I don't mean dense in terms of difficult to read. The sentences are easy to read. It flies right by. But there's so many great ideas in it that it's just got my mind swimming a little bit.
When you first talked to me about this, every time Rick and I have conversations, he brings up 3 or 4 books. I usually buy all of them, and I fall behind on the books. And I've heard this one before, and so I've not gotten all the way through it. But when we first talked about it, you talked about that core, the beginning of the book where he talks about 1776 being the core to so much of what goes on through his dialogue, what has changed the world. Much of it happened really centered in 1776. Is that where you'd like to start?
1776 is just a little bit of a hook, is what it is. The larger, I think, paradigm is his word weirder as an acronym. You know, that our world is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, ex-Christian, and romantic. And the question is, how did we get here? And how did that happen? And he just very cleverly ties together all these things that happened in 1776. So it's, really remarkable. And he's a Brit, so he says for most Americans, only one thing happened in 1776. But he brings in other stuff, having to do with the invention of the steam engine, having to do with Thomas Paine and Adam Smith and their writings that appeared in 1776. He incorporates a meeting near the end of life with David Hume in 1776. I think Immanuel Kant was starting his Critique of Pure Reason in 1776. And then even little kind of fun things like Rock of Ages was composed in 1776. And Holy Trinity Clapham, a church that produced what's called the Clapham sect, was formed in 1776. And that was the group, the Clapham sect, that was largely responsible for abolishing slavery in England. So all kinds of interesting things that kind of weave themselves in and out of 1776. But the larger question is, how did we get to this world that we live in now? And the thing that I appreciate about it is there's 2 ways of looking at the world. One way is that what we're experiencing now is unique. And from our perspective, from a lot of people's perspective, is it's never been worse. It's getting worse and worse and worse. Everything's worse every year. This election that's coming up is the worst election. Morality is post-Obergefell, all of that. Another way of looking at the world is to say there's nothing new under the sun, that everything's pretty much the same as it's always been. I think there's truth in both of those. And I don't want to get drawn into a despair that says, we're heading downhill fast. I mean, even though I'm intrigued by that, the Rod Dreher Benedict option kind of mentality, I'm intrigued by it, but I don't think ultimately it satisfies, at least not me. And there are some things, and that's what's interesting about the Wilson book. Sexual immorality was rife in 1776, in the late 18th century, and we're not in the worst position we've ever been in.
What do you mean by sexual morality was rife in that time frame?
Well, one of the things that he brings out, he talks about secularization and how that takes place as a chapter. One of the most interesting chapters in the book is called Skeptics. And he talks about how, and he uses Voltaire and Diderot, as I mentioned, as his figurehead pieces. Voltaire wanting a basic belief in God, Diderot wanting atheism. But both of them united in their denunciation of Christianity and their hatred of the church. And so he uses those guys to talk about how, there's actually a pretty broad range. On the soft end is what he calls it, is a guy named Boswell. James Boswell wrote the biography of Samuel Johnson. And Boswell was very determined that he was a Christian. And he said, I wouldn't ever walk away from the faith. And he was appalled when he interviewed David Hume and found out that David Hume on his deathbed was quite content to say, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But Boswell was a bit of a scoundrel. So how is it that he's holding on to the faith? And then what Wilson does is he goes from soft to hard. And the hard end, which was beyond Diderot and Voltaire, was the Marquis de Sade. You almost can't bear to read the couple of pages that he's got on de Sade. There's never been a more depraved individual. And he was writing, and he was being published. And people didn't think highly of him, but still he was a prominent intellectual figure, at the time. So that's what I meant by the fact that there was bad stuff happening back then, just as there's bad stuff happening now. And I think that, two enemies that we've got in our brains all the time, one is amnesia and the other is nostalgia. We tend to remember 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as being, those were the good old days.
I remember the vacations, but not the work.
Yeah, right.
Interesting. One of the quotes in the book, it talks about Christianity became a victim of its own success. It baked its moral norms so deeply into Western culture that people eventually forgot where they came from. And I don't know if that's summarizing some of what you're saying, this idea of, hey, things were never worse, things were never better. These two views that maybe don't take as much of a calibrated or measured view of where we were, where we are, and what's going on.
Well, yeah, that's a central idea in the book. He quotes some guy, I can't remember who it was, who I think it was a Russian philosopher, that put it in a funny way. It said, we are descended from apes, therefore we must love one another. And just this notion of, Ben Franklin saying, I want you to alter the Declaration of Independence. That's one of the highlights of the book, is that historical recounting that Jefferson had written, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That is, they're derived from spiritual sources, from Christian sources. And Ben Franklin saying, no, let's alter that. Let's say we hold these truths to be self-evident. And, he makes a really good case that they're far from self-evident. They're anything but self-evident. So Christianity being, can't remember the way you said it, kind of its own.
It's a victim of its own success,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. So
it's part of the culture, and it's there in the background, but it's been forgotten. It's like faded into myth. It's not connected.
Yeah. So he's got, again, Wilson's such a fun writer, but there's a quote, I don't have it readily accessible, but, if you just take a simple category like human rights, where do human rights come from? Everybody on the streets of Peachtree City is going to be an advocate for human rights. And people are going to take conservative or liberal approaches to human rights, and they will accuse one another of not being sufficiently interested in human rights. But we take as a given, human rights. Where did that come from? He even says that it's kind of interesting. He has a little half a paragraph on the Beatles. All you need is love. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Why is love the central moral principle of the Beatles? Where did that come from? Again, it doesn't come from Buddhism. It doesn't come from Islam. It doesn't come from barbarians. It comes from Christianity. And so, that quote is a great one, that these ideas of freedom, real human freedom as well as religious liberty, the idea of human rights, and you could go on, all have their foundation in Christian thinking. And they are so rock bottom in our society that people have forgotten where they come from.
The rest of that quote is, it baked its moral norms so deeply into Western culture that people eventually forgot where they came from. Right. You gave the quote from the Beatles, about love. And there's a bit of equivocation on that term in terms of what's meant, but there's still connection into Western culture, back into Christianity, about what that means. Even though it might get distorted, it's not starting from a blank slate with nothing. It might be damaged, but it's still there. I wanted to explore the quote about the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and how that was changed from we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. So there was a little bit of an assumption about what that change meant from Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. So when it's changed to self-evident, and you said they're not really self-evident, how do you think that impacts our thinking, or what changed at that time?
Well, I think what Franklin was saying was, that these things are apparent to anyone through their capacity to reason. So if you reason things out and think them through, you are going to find these truths to be self-evident. Again, I think that if that's true, why did those ideas not arise out of the Far East? Why did they not arise out of sub-Saharan Africa? They only came about in one set of circumstances. And I think that Wilson actually does a great job trying to steer us away from some kind of parochial superiority. It's complicated how we became as rich as we became, how we became the kind of people who would circle the globe seeking to find out more stuff, how we became scientific, all that stuff. I mean, he does a good job saying that there are multiple factors involved in that, but an absolutely central factor, is Christian belief. The idea that people are created by God, essentially equal, because they're created in his image, is something that's unique. And nobody can reason their way to it.
If it's flowing out of that pervasive mindset that people are created by God, then it's self-evident because that's the structure of how we think.
Right.
But I think one of the things you said, and maybe reflecting what Andrew Wilson said, is that's not all entirely self-evident if you remove the Christian worldview underpinning or the influence that's had on the culture, despite the fact that many people don't hold that. My father was an atheist. We had many good conversations. Much of what his life was grew out of this framework. If we got down to philosophy very deeply, he would have conversations that would deny that, but he wouldn't live his life any other way. So most of his life, his action, and much of his thinking was formed from the DNA of a Christian culture.
Yeah, and that just leads me, takes my brain in a completely different direction. I'm going to scratch my head and say, if people are still basically in tune with the fundamental ideals, then why do they leave the church? Why do they hate the church? Why is it so difficult to envision, what you and I experience as life-giving and a good check on our bad impulses. But also, I mean, when we're worshiping, we have a sense of fullness and destiny and eternity. Why is that repulsive to people? I would love people to come back to church, and I would love them to find the kind of community that is life-giving and that is the answer to the epidemic of loneliness rampant in our country. But more than that, more than simply the practical benefits, that they would find a resonance with the truths that are in the Bible, the holiness of God and the love of God, and how those two things perfectly coexist, without contradiction in the heart of God. And to find in that something that, is salvific, that really does have the end of saving our souls. Not just in a strictly theological formulation, but, even in its larger, almost poetic manifestation.